Of course. I'll give you very brief and casual, no slides or grand presentations needed. I began this book approximately 7 years ago. Actually, I arrived into Cambridge 7 years ago on Friday. And the book, in many ways, is a crystallization of those 7 years of work. I came to Cambridge in the first place because when I was lecturing climate change science and policy back in Australia at the Australian National University, I came across a problem. We always tried to finish the course with a couple of more uplifting lectures because by the end the students were dreadfully depressed for obvious reasons. And we always had one on social mobilization, protest movements, and another one on techno fixes, in particular solar geoengineering. Who's familiar roughly with solar geoengineering? One ain't too bad. It's pretty simple. Essentially, we have greenhouse gases that essentially act as a blanket in the atmosphere. They heat the world. So we use coolants, in particular aerosols. Yeah, exactly. There we go. Aerosols essentially reflect long-wave radiation and hence act as a coolant. So you kind of treat the Earth as a thermostat. The problem is that could backfire in a range of different ways. And it was in reading into how this could go wrong, I started thinking about all the other things that could destroy the world potentially apart from climate change. We could reduce emissions to zero by 2050. We could achieve that Herculean task, and yet in 2051, we could still have a nuclear war. We are still doomed, unfortunately. It struck me as a Pokemon problem. You got to catch them all. You have to address all the different sources of existential risk, which is what brought me to Caesar originally. And when I came to Caesar, I was struck by two things across my peers and my colleagues. One was everyone was very forward-focused. They were looking at particular speculative technologies, things like engineered pandemics through CRISPR-Cas9, advanced algorithms and AI. Very few people look towards the past. And to me, it's like kind of useful to look at the empirical track record of how societies have risen and fallen in 5,000 years. But additionally, I found that everyone, when they looked to the future, they always had a vision of the past in mind. They always had some assumptions about human nature, some assumptions about how the world had came to this current point. And often they weren't really clearly thought through about why those assumptions came, where they came from. So to me, when I started this book, it was really anchored upon two things. One was to understand and think through how have societies collapsed over the past 5,000 years. That ended up being actually quite a gargantuan task because once you ask, why did societies collapse, you have to ask, what is collapsing? Were civilizations good or bad for their citizens? Was collapse necessarily a bad thing? Suddenly you start to unravel all the biggest questions across history. Apart from looking at the history and future side of collapse, the other thing I wanted to do was to think through what are the actual root causes of existential risk. If I joined Caesar back in 1945, it didn't exist back then, let's just assume it did. If I was working on existential risk back in 1945, I would really only be studying one thing: nuclear weapons. Climate change, we knew about the greenhouse effect, but it wasn't really on anyone's radar. AI, I.J. Good didn't really talk about ultra intelligence until 1951. Most of the threats weren't really on the horizon. Suddenly today, I have colleagues who work across synthetic biology, AI, a range of different topics. And it's worth asking, is it likely to stop at the current threats we know? Already, the military is working on things like ultra-short laser bombardment from space. And of course, there's things like quantum computing, which may potentially undermine privacy worldwide and usher in new mass surveillance states. The key question for me is, why is it that we have a system that keeps on producing different kinds of catastrophic risk over time? Because if we solve one thing, unfortunately, if the system keeps producing risk in the long term, we are, once again, still doomed. And in the book, I have a whole bunch of hot takes you'll probably enjoy, maybe disagree with as well. I'll just kind of really briefly skim the surface here, since we want to have time for both the fireside chat as well as the actual Q&A. But what I put forward is that humans aren't that bad. So I think often we think about collapse, our thoughts are colored by 17th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes, that without kings, without structural authority, we tend to be disorganized, violent, self-interested. We lead lives which are nasty, brutish, and short. Hobbes, when he came up with this vision, was essentially just compiling a list of psychological assumptions about humans and then using that to paint a very dark picture of our ancient past. In reality, when you actually look at archaeology, anthropology, and even studies of modern day disaster risk, and how people react during terrorist attacks, volcanoes, tornadoes, etc., you see a very different picture. There's a pretty strong consensus that mass panic doesn't exist. Instead, during disasters, people tend to be very good at being pro-social, altruistic, and self-organizing. Who's heard of boat lift? So boat lift was the largest maritime evacuation that's ever occurred, even larger than Dunkirk. It happened on the day of 9/11. People need to be evacuated from Manhattan Island across the Hudson Valley. The Coast Guard put out a call for others to help. Within 24 hours, over 500,000 people had been moved across that river. Almost all the boats were not from the Coast Guard. They had very few vessels. Instead, it was everyday people taking out their ships, would be fishing vessels, yachts, etc., to ferry people across the river. That's how people tend to react to these situations. And indeed, when you actually think about our deep past, evolutionarily, it would have been a recipe for disaster. Every time we came across any kind of disaster, we immediately started to kill each other and fall into disorder. That's not how one wins the evolutionary race. To the contrary, when we look at our past, both systematic skeletal analysis as well as genetic analyses all suggest that violence is pretty low, probably between 1 to 2%. So for every 100 people born 300,000 years ago, probably only 1 or 2 died at the hands of another human being. Similarly, we seem to be pretty good at actually cooperating across groups. 140,000 years ago, from the east coast to the west coast of Africa, we have evidence of shared lithic instruments, so stone tools, genes, culture, and even musical instruments. Essentially, they were cooperating, trading all the way from one side of Africa to the other over 3,000 kilometers. And you see this also in Europe, from Siberia to Spain, what's called the Aurignacian culture, and in North America, what's called the Clovis culture. But in short, we're pretty good. That was one thing I understood, and that also gave me an insight that collapse isn't always a bad thing, at least historically. When we look at collapses, both in the past but even more recent, they often can lead to some surprising benefits. After the fall of the West Roman Empire, people end up being taller and healthier. Human height is a pretty good overall biophysical indicator of health. People who are tall tend to have more calories, more protein in particular, less disease, and more exercise. They also had less trauma on their bones, so less bone lesions, less holes in the teeth, less dental cavities. And the natural retort here is, but look, so many people died. That only the survivors had extra resources. That doesn't quite check out. Even the people who lived outside the empire actually were taller and healthier. Indeed, some analyses from archaeologists suggest that basically Roman citizens were 8 centimeters shorter than they should have been because they were growing very tall prior to the rise of Rome, and that basically stagnated after Rome. And you see this in the modern world. Somalia, 991, falls apart, the Bahrain regime crumbles, falls into civil war, and yet maternal mortality a decade later is down by 30%, infant mortality by 24%, and extreme poverty by 20%. You're essentially better off being stateless than you were being under the predatory Bahrain regime, which gives us pretty good insight into what states in the past were actually like. They were usually quite unequal and predatory. One analysis of 28 pre-modern states found that on average, there was 77% towards the theoretical maximum level of inequality. That maximum level is where one individual takes all the surplus and everyone else has just enough to survive and reproduce. While collapse was often a good thing historically, I also point out in the book that's unlikely to be the case going into the future. For a few reasons. A, it's likely to be global now. B, states, at least some of them, actually do a pretty good job. They provide lots of public benefits and goods, and they're quite accountable. If Denmark fell apart, it probably wouldn't be good for its citizens, even if Somalia falling apart was. Similarly, today we actually rely much more upon globalized, industrialized infrastructure, and we can't easily return to hunting and gathering or farming as our ancestors once did. And last but not least, one of the bad things that always does happen in the case of collapse is there is a spasm of violence, where, generally speaking, groups of armed young men try to recreate a power structure. Previously, that was done with muskets, handheld bronze and iron axes and swords, bows and arrows. Today we have nuclear weapons and we also have killer weapons. So there's some of the hot takes. That's often a good thing. It's unlikely to be so in the future. And just a quick little answer to that question of what are the root causes behind the threats we face today, behind existential risk? In the book, I point towards a pretty common answer that a lot of people give, including even the developers of AI today, which is it's arms races. If we don't do it, China will. Or in the past, Russia will. The bad guys will get it first. What's interesting is this comes back to a body of literature most of you people probably know about, game theory. Everyone's heard of game theory, roughly? Yeah. Essentially, the study of how different agents interact in a game theoretic context when you assume all the agents are self-interested and competitive. The interesting thing is that while you often end up with these game theoretic traps, arms races, for instance, and prisoner's dilemmas, they often don't actually end up happening to people in real life. When you do laboratory experiments, often people don't end up in prisoner's dilemmas, arms races, etc. Even the tragedy of the commons, which many of you may have heard of, but if you have a group of people using a common resource, they tend to overuse it due to self-interested proclivities. As soon as you do that in a laboratory setting, but you let people communicate, it disappears. Similarly, historically, we have numerous different examples of cultures that existed for thousands, often tens of thousands of years, without seemingly over-degrading their environments or falling into arms races, etc. In the book, I point towards some findings that do suggest certain types of people, and potentially certain types of institutions, do fall into these traps. One is people who are higher in the dark triad, Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy. People who are higher in those traits, those antisocial traits, tend to be the ones who defect in these games, and they can often spark reprisals. The second is, interestingly enough, economics and finance students, because it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy where they think everyone else is going to behave in self-interest fashion, and hence they do so. And once again, it sparks a vicious cycle. In the book, I put forward the case that our institutions behave in a very similar way. If you took the US or the UK, the government, and you boiled it down to a person, what would they look like? They give less than 1% of their wealth to charity and to the less needy. They're constantly stockpiling weapons. They bully and intimidate even their very closest friends. They're constantly boasting about themselves and the smallest little good things they do. And if you run them through a barrage of psychology tests, they probably rank pretty high in the dark triad. In short, our institutions clearly are not amplifying the best of us. And they're the things which tend to fall into these, what I call Goliath traps. And unless you address that in the long term, we are likely caught. There's a lot more to it than that. I go all the way back to one of the actual psychological features which create these institutions. Environmentally, why do we end up with these institutions 5,000 years ago? That's the kind of rough key idea behind it. So that's a very, very brief scratching the surface overview. And I guess we'll go on to the fireside chat and then looking forward to your questions as well.
So great, on that note, happy note, we can begin with well, the title of the book is Goliath's Curse, and I think you have a very specific definition of what Goliath means. It's not just a civilization or something, it's about collection hierarchies. Do you maybe want to expand?
When I first tried to write a book on societal collapse, the key question you face is, what is collapsing? And the typical response is civilization. I came across two problems with that response. One is that the definitions aren't very good. They tend to be either a checklist of factors. So the Australian archaeologist Gordon Schild came up with a list of 10 different factors, things like long distance trade, which technically speaking, even hunter-gatherers have, or things like routing, which the Inca Empire didn't have despite the fact that it stretched all the way from Argentina to Chile. So that's not a particularly useful definition. Another one is having an advanced culture, which is a bit biased against indigenous peoples and also isn't particularly, it's kind of vague and not particularly precise or useful. When you look empirically, what actually changes when we look at the cradles of civilization, Uruk in Mesopotamia, the first dynasty of Egypt, the Shah dynasty in China, there's a couple of things they all share. One is in every single case, without fail, they're preceded by warfare. The second is they almost always involve mass human sacrifice. Even ones like Cahokia, which was located 500 kilometers southwest of Chicago, actually on the outskirts of St. Louis. I think we have a St. Louis native. Cahokia was essentially the first city of the United States, roughly 10,000, 15,000 people. And what you see in Cahokia is, first of all, very cool and interesting. There's a series of flat top pyramids, which appear to have been built after importation of corn from Mesoamerica. So basically, corn and the Three Sisters in general, beans, squash, and corn, were imported from kind of the Maya and the Zapotec, from Mesoamerica, the Basin of Mexico, all the way up to the US Southwest, up along the Mississippi, and end up in Cahokia. 100 years after corn arrives, Cahokia starts to build these pyramids, but it also becomes much more hierarchical. They end up with these grand pyramids around a big central plaza, but also a priest class who's ruling over them and sacrificing people. Might seem familiar, looks kind of similar to the Maya. So it's likely they didn't just import grain, but also ideas from Mesoamerica. Either way, Cahokia goes through what a whole bunch of states go through. They basically have an explosion of violence, they have human sacrifice, they have rulers, but interestingly, they collapse. But the most fascinating thing about Cahokia is it never comes back. In the case of Egypt, Uruk, etc., you almost always have these new structures emerging, civilization, if you will, after it collapses. And Cahokia collapses, never comes back. And interestingly, they have no oral tradition about it. It's like they intentionally wanted to forget. But come back to the question, I got distracted by Cahokia. What you really see in all these cases, the only uniting factor is their dominance hierarchies. You have a switch away from people living in more egalitarian arrangements to situations in which an individual or a small group is ranked above others. And they usually will essentially take resources and labor from the others. In essence, we start to look a bit more like the hierarchies of chimpanzees and the harems of gorillas than anything else. And you actually also see this in genetic record, roughly 4,000 to 8,000 years ago. There's a bottleneck in the Y chromosome. It's a small number of men that start to rise reproduction. But essentially, what you see is a collection of dominance hierarchies emerging, not just the state, not just kingdoms and empires, but also divisions between men and women, rich and poor, slave and master. That's what I call a Goliath. And I think Goliath is much more fitting. I mean, civilization, hate to say it, has always been a bit of a tool of propaganda. It was used to justify colonial conquest, for instance. And it has its Latin root in civilitas, which means it has connotations of civilized conduct, political virtue, wisdom, moderation, restraint. That's not what I usually associate with sacrifice, human sacrifice, slavery, and warfare. Instead, Goliath works pretty well because a Goliath, based on the biblical tale, is large, imposing, it works through force, and it's also surprisingly fragile.
So it's interesting that you're talking about, in your opening talk, you were talking about modern day, there's nuclear catastrophes, and this is different to previous societal collapses of Goliaths. Maybe we can talk about like early Goliaths, early civilizations, because I think one thing that you discuss is that civilization, as we know, perhaps Bronze Age civilizations, or maybe even before that, we did have large scale populations of people living together, and these were not necessarily falling into the Goliath trap, as you put it.
Yes, one of the typical stories we often have in the history is that agriculture de facto leads to hierarchy, and hierarchy is kind of necessary to build cool things. So this varies all the way from Marx to Smith, who actually have the same kind of theory, that once you have a surplus provided by agriculture, you both have the means to suddenly give some of that surplus to managers, coordinators, kings, etc., but also they can start basically coordinating the larger workforce to do cool things like build monuments, do large-scale irrigation, wield armies, etc. What's interesting is that does happen in some cases, no doubt, but there's numerous cases across the world, including some of the first states like Tiwanaku in South America, where the opposite kind of occurs. You actually see cities and very large-scale infrastructure projects, irrigation canals, etc., occurring without any signs of elites, rulers, or even wealth inequality. Things like housing sizes seem to stay relatively equal. It's not until later on you start to see the emergence of elites shown through things like depictions of genealogy, depictions of leaders, etc. You start to see palaces, you start to see unequal houses. And interestingly, many of these cases, they actually collapse shortly thereafter. And in the case of places like Tiwanaku and Teotihuacan, Jayajana, the collapse occurs with signs of rebellion, where there seems to be targeting of elite infrastructure and iconography. So it's not like everything is burnt down, just the main temples, pyramids, and elite residences are burned down. But interestingly, it does seem like there's many cases where we did pretty large-scale cooperation without necessarily resorting to having a Goliath. One of the most interesting, fascinating examples is the Indus Valley civilization, or the Harappan, which some of you may have heard of. It's a collection of cities throughout modern-day Pakistan and the Indus Valley, the largest of which, Mohenjo-daro, was probably roughly 40,000 people. They had plumbing well beyond their time, so we often hold up Rome for having its plumbing. The Indus had the same thing. They were pretty economically advanced, trading all the way to Mesopotamia. They had large-scale cities, huge bathhouses, and shared public monuments, but we have no signs of inequality or leaders. And for a long period of time, archaeologists kind of assumed, well, there must have been something here. There's a really good article from a colleague of mine here at Cambridge, Adam Green, called Killing the Priest King, which basically puts forward the case that we've been excavating this for over 100 years. We can't see any signs of hierarchy. We have to assuming that there was something there. People may have just found other ways of coordinating. And I think that's actually a pretty hopeful, enlightening prospect, that we don't necessarily always have to lock ourselves into one structure. As humans, we can actually organize in a whole bunch of different ways, which can work well. That being said, it does seem like when you have certain ingredients, you almost always end up with Goliath.
It's interesting that you're talking about basically how we're venerating the wrong civilizations, essentially, at least with respect to human flourishing, human welfare. The cover of your book, I believe, is Ramesses II.
Yeah.
And he was one of the ancient Egyptian pharaohs. And those Bronze Age civilizations were something that we regard as the first step in history as like organized civilization.
Mm.
We had elites forming. We had the emergence of division of labor. Division of labor. And also you mentioned Rome and how we remember the engineering and the benefits that came from that, but not necessarily the human cost.
Yeah.
It's also quite interesting using Rome as an example, because it has its backstory about Romulus and Remus is not about cooperation at all. It's about, one brother killing the other. So I'm curious how you reconcile this cultural veneration of very horrible events, not necessarily veneration, but we remember them, they stick in our heads more, rather than things which we should be more uplifting, like large-scale cooperation, the prisoner's dilemma, essentially breaking down, where we might assume that in this situation people wouldn't cooperate, but we actually do. So kind of, how do you explain the difference between what we remember and what is actually true?
And so first of all, on the side, Ramses II, he had a Greek name, Ozymandias. Many of you may have heard the classic Claps poem, I'm Ozymandias, king of kings, look upon my works, you mighty in despair. So there's an interesting kind of story there. But Ramses is also indicative of the problem here. So Ramses had a battle called the Battle of Kadesh with the Hittites. And in the common retelling, which is told from Ramses' point of view, essentially they were losing the battle until Ramses turned into Rambo and essentially slaughtered the entire Hittite army. They whirled out of there. When you actually look at the evidence here, it seems like they lost the battle quite convincingly. Ramses probably was not Rambo, as far as we can tell. And he basically came back and just engraved so deeply into the monuments that no one could essentially carve at the top of it. It was the original fake news, if you will. But it's important to remember that when we look at history, we're not always getting a clear, neutral view. Only a very small sliver of society mastered writing in the past until the printing press. They were almost always employed by kings and the rich. Similarly, as an archaeologist, you're likely to be rewarded for it. It's also much easier to find things like palaces, ziggurats, temples, cities, etc. That's not where most people lived. Even at the height of the Western Roman Empire, over 90% of people lived on farms rather than Rome. So we're not getting a good insight into how collapse actually affects most people, nor even how empire necessarily affects most people. And I think a really telling example here is comparing how we remember Rome, for instance, compared to how the indigenous people of North America remember places apart from Cahokia. So Cahokia was just one of a set of different cities and hierarchical communities across the US 1,000 years ago. If you go further down, there was also the Puebloan communities, the very first farmers who lived in the American Southwest and modern New Mexico. They built these big sandstone houses. There was also the Huhugan, who were basically more or less where modern day Phoenix, Arizona is. Interestingly, Phoenix is called Phoenix because the European settlers or invaders wanted to basically birth a new civilization from the ashes of the old. They found the old pyramids, ball courts, and irrigation systems of the Huhugan. There was also a whole bunch of others throughout the Appalachians, including a big site called Moundville. But essentially, these all collapsed in a synchronized fashion approximately 750 years ago during the onset of the Little Ice Age. What's really interesting is how these are remembered. In the case of Cahokia, of course, it's not remembered at all, but the others do have certain myths. So the Beloans, for instance, today they have the story of the Great Gambler. The Great Gambler was a god who came to Earth and was preternaturally good at gambling, to the extent that he gambled so effectively that he basically won all the children, wives, men, property of the existing Beloan communities. He promised to give them back in exchange for the people building him great sandstone houses. Eventually, the people rebelled. They allied themselves with a group of alliance of gods and overthrew the Great Gambler and decided that was a bad idea. Let's not do that again. There's really similar ones. So the Cherokee people, who basically more or less formed a confederation over where the Moundville and the kind of Appalachians were. They have the story of the Anakotani. And the Anakotani were essentially a priest class there who grew increasingly oppressive. They wielded evil magical powers. In some cases, they were cannibals. Until eventually, once again, they too were overthrown in mass rebellion. And then there's the Huhugan. In the case of Huhugan, they remember once again a priest class who rose up, took over the society. They persecuted their cultural hero, Elder Brother, until eventually Elder Brother formed a coalition with other minor gods and the people, and eventually overthrew them. But it's really interesting to compare that to how we remember 2,000 years of Imperial China, for instance, or how we remember Rome. And granted, Rome has some very cool things. I love the Colosseum, the Senate looks fantastic, but we also need to bear in mind that if you want to find a place where women are rounded up in droves by armed young men and then sold into slavery, or where hundreds of people get sacrificed through crucifixion at a time, you can go to Rome or you can go to ISIS. No choice. We tend to view Daesh and ISIS very differently to how we view Rome. And similarly, we view Rome very differently to how the Puebloans viewed their ancient past. Key question is, who's viewing it more accurately? I'll leave you to decide.
Speaking about these specific Goliaths, what's interesting to me about maybe the Bronze Age collapse is that the argument of your book is essentially that there's a collection of dominance hierarchies that are making institutions brittle to change and they're unable to adapt. But when we look at something like the Bronze Age collapse, it seems like a lot of it was kind of not anybody's fault, though.
Yeah.
May have been. I think the systems theory is generally that there were a lot of earthquakes and volcanic eruptions at the time. The sea peoples came over with iron weapons. There was a tin scarcity for the Bronze Age empires. So is it even possible to adjust your civilization in such a way that you can be resilient? What would you say to Ramses II or any of the other leaders to make their civilizations more resilient?
Probably would first of all just tell Ramses, look, maybe just be honest with people, you're not actually God. You're not necessarily the best decision making either, nor are you Rambo.
Yeah.
It's difficult because obviously Ramses had an entire infrastructure, an entire society built upon more or less a kind of royal burial cult. Like most of the Egyptian surplus went towards either the army or, in this case, building very large scale pyramids. So to really avert collapse in this case, it would require pretty wholesale change, I think, of what they're doing. One of the key problems here is that, so first of all, who's familiar with the Late Bronze Age, roughly? Cool. Very briefly, the Late Bronze Age, so roughly kind of like 1500 BC to roughly 1177 BC, you have a collection of different empires and states throughout the Mediterranean and the Levant. So this included both the Mycenae, essentially the kind of the original warlords of southern Greece. They lived in palaces and they've essentially been little protection rackets throughout Greece. You had the Middle Egyptian Kingdom. You also had the Hittites, the Kassites, the Babylonians, and numerous others. Essentially, they're all a big bunch of different empires who they traded very intensely, both family members that had a lot of pacts based upon intermarriage, but they also traded particularly intensely in copper and tin. Copper and tin are the prerequisite of what we know as bronze, a metal alloy which obviously characterizes the age. Important to remember, bronze actually wasn't that useful to most people. Most farmers wouldn't have used bronze, but it was very useful as a weapon and as an elite kind of decoration of sorts. But either way, they were heavily dependent upon each other, to the extent where one calculation by my friend and colleague, archaeologist Eric Klein, he's written kind of the best book on the late Bronze Age collapse, called 1177, the year the civilization collapsed. He's done some studies suggesting that just the collapse of two, so in this case, I think it was the Hittites plus Ugarit, which was a big trading hub. Just those two collapsing probably was enough to destabilize the entire network, particularly because you get knock-on effects. If Ugarit collapses, suddenly you get lots of pirates. The pirates are likely to attack other cities across the trade network. Prices fluctuate dramatically, particularly for tin and copper. You start to get knock-on effects throughout the system. I think this is something which tends to happen in general when you get empires cropping up in close proximity. They tend to become increasingly interdependent over time. And of course, we see that today with the modern globalized world, where most nation states are pretty interdependent on a whole bunch of things. And that can have benefits. There is, of course, democratic peace theory, but also the theory of liberalism that essentially trading states are less likely to go to war. But if you have too much dependence, that can become a frailty or fragility. And I think that's what the late Bronze Age saw. So if I was advising Ramses, I'd probably recommend that, he changes society in a whole bunch of ways to benefit the welfare of his citizens, but also to become a bit less dependent upon the Hittites and Ugarit. And actually, interestingly, Egypt was a bit less dependent in general, which is probably one of the reasons they didn't collapse as badly as, say, the Hittites.
It's interesting that you're saying that you should become less dependent on other nations because, I think the point of your book is that there's trends across history where this happens. I think one interesting thing to me is the Great Depression. The prelude was, I believe it was Herbert Hoover who passed the Tariff Act, which basically was an attempt to protect American agriculture, but it ended up basically birthing economic nationalism in many countries. And so, in a sense, they're doing what you said. They're becoming robust, but unfortunately, arguably a result of this economic nationalism was like Nazism, Imperial Japan. So, I guess for the final 10 minutes of this discussion, I kind of want to talk about what you feel are like the concrete things that societies can do, apart from, you mentioned that you think that they should become basically, you should democratize power basically. In light of this example, like maybe how would you address that specific point?
Yeah, it's worthwhile taking a minute or two to quickly discuss why does societies collapse in the first place, which we haven't gone into too much, but very briefly, very much surface level. In the book, I put forward the case that societies tend to collapse because of rising inequality. That has a whole bunch of knock-on effects that essentially make a society more vulnerable over time. And you see this all the way from the very first farming communities in cities through to the very largest empires. So farming, for instance, begins in Europe pretty much when roughly 9,000 BCE. Farmers go from modern-day Turkey and Anatolia, basically come up over the space of 4,000 years, branch out into Ireland, Scandinavia, Britain. And then after basically growing out over the space of 3 or 4 centuries, they start to collapse. Within usually 1 to 3 centuries, you have population drops up to 70% in Scandinavia, for instance. In every single one of those cases, you also start to see inequality rising up as well. And you start to see the emergence of warfare. Don't before that see palisades, fortifications, or even signs of basically torture, mutilation, and mass killings, you suddenly do. And this is actually pretty common across the world. General inequality tends to more or less go hand in hand with larger scale warfare. Indeed, the very first clear-cut case we have of organized warfare was over Obsidian, the Halafians in northern Mesopotamia, roughly 5,600 BC. But beyond that, inequality seems to have a whole bunch of knock-on effects, even for the very largest empires. And these range from an overproduction of elites, having basically too many people at the top competing for a small number of high status positions like a throne, tends to lead to things like civil wars, coup, power struggles. It's based upon Peter Turchin's work and many others in structured factor theory. You also tend to have just the fact that inequality just doesn't seem to work very well for many societies. There's been several books, including the Inner Level and the Spirit Level, basically looking at how, whether you look across the OECD or in the United States, in general, more unequal societies tend to have high levels of social political violence, environmental degradation, polarization, etc. And each of these things also have their own pretty dedicated literatures. And apart from that, in the book, I also go into how when you tend to have a small number of people making decisions who are overly invested in status quo, they're less likely to make good decisions to evade impending disaster. But in short, there's always knock-on effects that tend to make a state more fragile and more prone to collapse. Worthwhile noting that my favorite historian, Walter Scheidel, has actually labeled both the Han Dynasty and the Western Empire as examples of exactly this, called diminishing returns and extraction. That is, I think, a problem. Right now, if you look at Germany, Australia, the US, and the UK, there's some similarities. All of them have rising wealth inequality. All of them have problems of polarization, the rise of the far right. All of them have a declining rate of trust in public institutions. And I think that's all part of diminishing returns on extraction. That's actually not the thing that worries me most today. I'm a scholar of existential risk, and of course, the things that tend to worry me most are things like AI, climate change, killer robots, engineered pandemics, etc. But the interesting thing there is, even if you look at those, they tend to be based upon inequality. If you want to build a large language model, or you want to build a lethal autonomous weapon, you need things like cobalt. 70% of the cobalt supply comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And around about 40% of the people digging it up are artisanal miners working in unregulated industries, often getting paid a couple of dollars a day. They work in pretty much close to slave-like conditions. And the question is, if you didn't have an inequality, if they were actually being paid properly, would it suddenly be profitable to build these things? Similarly, nuclear weapons, who's heard of Shinkolobwe? Shinkolobwe, so it's a mine in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's the world's purest uranium mine. It's named after an apple, which when you squeeze it, it leaves a burn on the skin, because the people who work there tend to get radiation poisoning. The Manhattan Project sourced roughly 70% of its uranium from Shinkolobwe. Shinkolobwe at the time was also under Belgian authority, and for those of you who don't know, the Belgians were not known for being particularly good colonizers. And once again, they got it for a cutthroat price because the people were basically working in slave-like conditions. And of course, building a large language model, you basically have to steal large amounts of data. And when you look at the production of existential risk, it tends to be highly concentrated. Nuclear weapons, 85% stockpile is just two countries, the US and Russia. Similarly, if you're looking at cumulative global emissions for climate change, roughly 80% comes from 10 countries if you count the EU as one, 25% just from one country, the US. If you're looking at companies, then for nuclear weapons, roughly 28 companies are responsible for maintaining and upgrading the weapons. And in the case of climate change, since 2016, approximately 60 companies are responsible for roughly 80% of emissions. But all this stuff is very concentrated, and it's very much based on it. In the book, I put forward a whole bunch of different measures. I mean, there's some pretty obvious ones. We know more or less what we need to do. We need to have much more investment into AI safety. We need to slow down with it as well. We need to abolish nuclear weapons. We need to phase out carbon emissions. The list goes on, essentially. The key question is, what's the structural things that are impeding us from doing so? And as a short little anecdote, which I think could be quite revealing, I think gives us an insight as to one key thing we can do. So I call it the Trinity jury. Are you guys familiar with the Trinity test? So the Manhattan Project was the quest to build the world's first atomic weapon. And in 1945, the US did so by detonating the Trinity test in the sands of New Mexico in July. The night beforehand, the scientists were taking bets as to whether this would destroy the entire world, because the physicist Edward Teller had made a calculation that there was a non-zero probability that igniting the bomb would also ignite the entire atmosphere of Earth, hence killing not just every human, but every single thread of life, potentially leaving the entire cosmos silent. At that time, the US also knew that the Nazis were no longer pursuing their own nuclear weapon, nor were they capable of building one. They still went ahead and took that risk. In the book, I put forward the thought experiment of imagine if you had a citizens' jury. So you randomly selected 12 people from across the United States, nurses, farmers, cleaners, etc. And you gave them all this information. You said, look, there's a non-zero chance this potentially kills everyone, including everyone you know and love. And by the way, the Nazis are no longer building their own bomb. This is mainly about showing off to the Soviet Union. Do we think they say yes? Please go ahead and detonate the weapon. I've yet to see anyone actually say yes, they would. The only person who said yes was saying yes because I think it would be a corrupted process and the US officials would have found a way, which also kind of proves the point. But this goes for a whole range of things. Back in the 1970s, Exxon and BP knew about climate change and they intentionally buried the information. Once again, if you had a citizens' jury sitting in that room, do we think they would have said, yeah, it's a great idea, please go ahead? And I think the same thing happens when we look at even AGI companies that are operating right now. A large number of people have left and have called for greater whistleblower protections and whatnot. And even if you look at survey data, most people actually don't want superintelligence to be built. So one of the things I call from the book is a leveling of power and essentially just a reversion back to more democratic forms of government, particularly through the use of things like citizen assemblies and juries, which have a swelling body of literature. These often result in less polarization, more legitimacy, and often just better decisions, and also more risk aversion. So that's one of the key things I really call for the book. Is rather than just thinking we can build safe superintelligence and use that to solve our problems, making sure we build safe superintelligence in the first place by having democracy.
I think I may be part of that small minority who thinks that they would vote have nuclear weapons. I think the interesting thing for me is that basically what we've been going through is like there are systemic kind of dynamics, like prisoner dynamics, which basically mean that people tend towards something like nuclear weapons or superintelligence that if you ask someone in an atomic decision, would you want this thing? They would probably say no.
Yeah.
But I think like what is interesting is one of the things you mentioned in the book is like the way we do that is basically adhering to the mantra of like, don't be a dick. If you are in a position where you are able to work on something, don't work for things which are actively trying to destroy the world. If you're able to share power, you should do it. And I think one reason why I would say maybe they would say yes is because I can maybe sympathize with the idea of like fear of missing out. That I mean, as in I can understand why they would feel have that feeling, and especially when we're talking about systems of government and we built elites primarily because there's a division of labor, people who are handling the administrative and kind of systems level thinking. Perhaps they would be better placed to make the decision than people in society. So I guess taking all of this together, and maybe like directly at me, because perhaps this is what your book is aiming at. People are skeptical. What would you say to me to like convince me that what we need is more democracy? And how would we know that, considering we're all liberals here, probably we're all hopefully pro-democracy, that we're not just kind of saying, hey, you're a Democrat, right? More democracy is the answer to the thing. I think you even said yourself that at some point you were believing that benevolent dictators type of way to solve a lot of these problems.
Yeah, so interesting, before I started the book, I was a bit of a believer in maybe we just need an enlightened despot, someone like me, to essentially usher in a whole bunch of big structural reforms to improve the world. It's pretty frustrated with how climate policy is going in Australia, for instance. I think I was also pretty down on humans in general, probably had a bit more of a Hobbesian outlook as well. And I changed my mind quite dramatically in the course of researching and writing the book. And that's for a few reasons. One, it became pretty obvious that what's happening in Australia is not that everyday people don't want climate action. The surveys are pretty clear they do. It's that we have an entire fossil fuel industry dedicated to stopping that, basically. There's an entire book, actually, a colleague of mine recently produced called Climate Obstructionism. So it's like 600 pages, small font, just going through all the different tactics, strategies, and campaigns the fossil fuel industry has run to essentially slow action quite successfully on climate change. And even the idea that we're all to blame seems to at least partially be driven by the fossil fuel industry. Back in 2004, BP had a campaign of essentially giving people carbon footprint calculators and encouraging them to basically think of this as what can you voluntarily do to help stop things? At the same time, they merged into ExxonMobil, and I think they had like 100 billion in revenue and producing how many barrels of oil a day. But quite clear who the problem was, and they intentionally try to place it on citizens at the advice of a PR firm called Ogilvy and Mather, who basically said, try to make sure people aren't looking at you. Put it back with them. But anyway, I think it's quite clear that across these cases, it's not really about people per se. It is by and large about a small number of key powerful actors. And even like the division of labor thing, that was something I believed once before as well, but it's really hard to explain where kingdoms appear or where empires appear across the world by just appealing to division of labor. There's very populous areas of agriculture that don't get kings or empires. The only thing that really explains it is lootable resources that can be easily seen, stolen, and stored, things like wheat. But if I was really trying to convince someone, I guess I'd go back to two key things. One is that we have loads of literature on this already. If you're looking for what countries on average make the best long-term decisions in terms of things like climate change, pensions, etc., it has a very strong correlation with democracy. There's democratic peace theory, for instance, and there's an entire realm of what's called deliberative democracy, which basically looks at doing these citizen assemblies and juries. And once again, it's pretty equivocal. They tend to result in better outcomes in a whole bunch of ways. And importantly, it's not that you're either relying upon technocrats and people who understand these problems acutely and have a systems level perspective, or misinformed citizens. In all these cases, you have citizens come together and they're informed by a raft of different experts. So they are given a systems level perspective as well. But in general, I think it's very hard to actually look at that literature and to look at real world outcomes and come to the conclusion of what we're doing right now is better than that. It's worthwhile bearing in mind the democracy we have, it's really just a representative parliamentary system that was invented a couple of hundred years ago in the UK, then got exploited through colonization. There's other ways of doing it, and there's better ways of doing it. And for me, this is just about looking at decision making as a science and thinking through what's the best way that's kind of risk averse of doing this. And it seems to be pretty clear that democracy is that. And apart from that, I could also appeal to your moral instincts. For a very simple one, who's heard of the veil of ignorance? Yeah, very classical one. Think of it this way. If you're going to be born to a society, you don't know where you're going to be born or who you are, but you get to choose the decision-making system. What do you choose? Do you want to be under despotism on the very lucky chance that there's a 1 in 1 billion chance you're going to be the despot? Or would you like to see a system where political power is equally shared? And no matter what, you are going to have an equal say. So I think there's both very strong ethical reasons and also very strong kind of just evidential reasons to favor democracy.
Sure. Thanks, Luke, for your talk today.
Excellent. Thank you.
So yeah, can I have a show of hands to ask questions? Okay. Maybe it's best if we do this so that if you keep your questions brief, like 30 seconds, then we have time to answer them. So if we start,
Thanks, Luke. Curious, I know a lot of people here are interested in like, their career and how to make the most impact with their choices. It strikes me that some of the conclusions from the book don't necessarily align with as easily with some of the collected, practical, important framework that EA often uses to make career decisions. So the question is that what would you recommend for people who buy the arguments of the book but also want to kind of use that EA framework to talk about their career?
First of all, I think the framework can work a little bit with regards to this. So if I think of trying to understand and study the root cause of existential risk, I'd say it's highly neglected. It's also super impactful. And I think I've written a book and it's actually practical as well. So I think you can apply this. I mean, one thing I'd like to see added to the framework is both co-benefits. So if you're trying to do something that's kind of low probability, really big for the world, what are the things that are going to happen even if you're wrong? So even if we can't build super intelligence and off chance it's impossible, what's going to be the impact of your job and your career anyway? And there's some things which just clearly are going to be good. Reducing emissions, for instance, just de facto good. 12 million people die from carbon emissions every year. So even if climate change doesn't end up being that bad, it's still not a bad thing to do. So I think co-benefits is something that helps the framework. And the other one, I echoed this towards the end of the book, is kind of thinking through what could go wrong. I think one thing we've done as a community sometimes is we've channeled people into certain professions where there's actually been a risk that they were more harm than good. We haven't had any good studies suggesting that working on AI safety doesn't add more to capabilities than AI safety. OpenAI was partially birthed from concerns about AI safety. And personally, I would say OpenAI has probably done more to spur an AI arms race than to actually subdue one. So it's worthwhile thinking through how could things go wrong as well, and choosing a career path which is more risky for those potential people. In terms of things I actually recommend people do, it depends on a whole bunch of things, including your skill set. I'd like to see people going to like kind of movement strategy, organizing, whatnot. I have a friend of mine actually who's working in the US on a kind of pause AI campaign of sorts, a bit different to the one we have in the UK. They seem to be having a whole bunch of traction so far. And all they're doing is basically applying their really good ops skills to trying to organize a movement around getting both people on the left and the right to oppose the creation of superintelligence. And something I also point to the book is that historically, we haven't seen that much progress since the agricultural revolution, whether you're looking at human height, real income, or potentially even happiness. Things don't really look good until roughly after the Industrial Revolution. But even there, things don't look good just because of tech. Directly after the Industrial Revolution, people get shorter and life expectancy drops even here in the UK. The thing that changes is you start to get big movements, suffragettes, unions, etc., who demand things like sanitation for all, the 40-hour working week, etc. So shared struggle and movements have been pretty important to actually winning big societal change in the past, and I suspect it'll be the same going into the future as well. And there's been a value to what EA's focused on in terms of kind of the insider strategy, but we also need essentially the outsider strategy.
I'm just going to read out the question when you say it so that people online can hear. But sorry, you're both putting your hands up and down.
It's so polite. I love it.
So love the top. Sorry. Yeah, really love the top. And something I really love how it takes like a bigger picture view. Because as someone who is not focused on AI safety, it's easy to get lost in the weeds and zoom out and you see what's the common thread between all of these and how it's concentrated. To really love the observation. I think something you mentioned was there are civilizations which have a less central power structure, less hierarchical, but you don't really see that nowadays, right? I feel that bringing back to an example about the nuclear testing, if you ask the jury, would they approve this or not? They would say no. I agree with that. But I think the issue lies in logistics. How do you assemble the jury, and how do you ensure that the information is like properly communicated to them? That they actually know that the Nazis don't have bomb. How that's a logistical issue. And I think that if you have centralized power, it's easier to make decisions faster. And so I guess my question is, what do you think of that? Like, how do you contend with like? I agree that the ideal is that everyone is fully aware and informed, but logistically it's difficult. I mean, think about like social media nowadays. People are misinformed about their choices. How do you reckon with that sort of a challenge?
Do you repeat the question? No answer.
I can repeat. I think you were speaking quite clearly.
Okay.
So I think that's that,
Cool, fantastic. That's an excellent question. Actually, kind of links to Benk's question a little bit. I agree. I think hierarchy, the beauty of the benefit is it's quicker. Simply telling someone, go and do this, otherwise you're fired or you get killed, it's pretty efficient. It's not necessarily the best decision will be made. It's not necessarily the best way in general to come to judgments, but it is quick. I think this is kind of where we need to do more work, basically. Like, we do know pretty effectively how to run a citizens assembly and jury, and we know the choice of facilitator matters immensely. For instance, we have pretty good protocols for selecting the right number of experts. And we do in some cases have kind of backup systems, so you can very easily call upon experts in a situation of crisis. Actually, a colleague of mine who's working in the UK government for exactly this purpose. But we do need to have more research and essentially more operationalization of how do you do democracy quickly, logistically, effectively at scale. For instance, one of the problems of citizen assemblies and juries is they're really expensive. Running one of these often takes up like $100,000 to do a proper assembly. Usually that's like a low ball estimate. But to me, this is the things we should be putting our resources towards. And today, even the UK probably spends at least 100 times more resources on facial recognition technology than on how to improve democracy, whether that be doing much quicker assemblies or, for instance, just improving voting dynamics. we should just start putting our money where our mouth is. And that's, I think, also a cause area we could actually have more people channel into is how do you have good, effective democratic governance of risk areas in a quick and cheap way? And that's, for me, that's actually more inspiring than thinking how do we get to Mars. Mars is cool, but how do we actually include everyone? How to do a democracy at scale? That's cool.
Sure. Great. Yeah, you.
I actually had that's the fun reframe. But yeah, I was basically going to ask about the deliberative citizen assembly. Because I kind of concerned that if you introduce these into broader kind of democracy or society where they coexist, this larger kind of epistemic structure, just freaking getting plagued by misinformation. Kind of how do you reconcile that? I mean, pretty much already answered.
It's still a good question. I haven't fully answered it.
Okay, yeah, but I'll try and shift it a bit kind of broader on global.
Yeah.
Because I was interested in about codependence. And I'm wondering, you know, this is such a big question to ask ahead of research, not many things. Domestic, democratic infrastructure. So think about ways that it's been that global tackles some of the issues at hand. It's about systemic fragmentation in that sense. But when you frame it like that, is that what sometimes needs to be enough?
Yeah. So I think it's useful to take a wider view of democracy. We tend to think of democracy just as one particular form of government. But I've mentioned it's really more of a spectrum of more or less inclusive and deliberative practices. It's also something you can do not just in government, but also in corporations and family units, etc., etc. And I do think that if you're going to have effective citizen assemblies and juries that kind of work to the best capacity, you're probably going to have wider cultural change as well. You know, right now, most of us get trained in schools, which were, and this is actually true, modeled off factories, basically. They're not really trying to teach people good critical thinking skills, nor even how to be good democratic citizens. Quite to the contrary, it's choosing much more about obedience and authority. So actually having education systems where people are both encouraged to and given kind of like good tutelage on how to be a good democratic citizen, I think would help immensely in terms of both addressing the epistemic crisis with that, but also making sure these systems work more effectively. I do think these systems probably would be better than the alternative at addressing things like misinformation, disinformation, because you basically have groups of people being face-to-face addressed by experts. And in general, that tends to address a whole bunch of misgivings they have. So one of the really common themes you have coming out of these assemblies is both people tend to respect each other more afterwards. So you have like Democrats and Republicans coming in being each other's throats. At the end, they've often converged, and at the very least, they respect each other even if they don't agree. But they usually often have become less prone to conspiracy theories like really out there ideas as well. They just tend to kind of self-correct as they get better information. So I do think it would help there, but I do think you're right. Like this should be part of like a much bigger cultural shift towards democracy, not just simply just chucking a couple of assemblies and juries here and there.
More of a practical question. So I'm also writing both about the history and psychology of work.
Cool.
And I'm curious how you were able to write a book that seems to span so many different eras, so many different subjects. I'm wondering how you're able to find the time to read so diversely and put something synthesizing. And as a follow-up question, also how you balanced sort of the bias towards forming a narrative versus truth seeking.
Yeah. So time, it took me 7 years to do so. And in many ways, it took longer than that insofar as a lot of the areas like climate change, existential risk, I've been building up an expertise for far longer. I frankly didn't have that much of a life over those 7 years. I didn't read any fiction books, for instance, during the 7 years. I only read non-fiction. I had a kind of rough protocol as well. So roughly 70% of what I've read was directly related to the book. About 20-25% was peripherally related, like think more like social psychology, for instance, and then about 5 to 10% was kind of like wild cards, which I think could be related, but I couldn't actually think of a genuine connection there. But sometimes it did emerge, like I read a book on status that actually being one of the key threads across the book. So time, resources, and also it's not an individual project. It does say one author there, but I relied upon lots of people. In the acknowledgements, I have, I think, over 2 or 3 dozen reviewers who have reviewed the entire book or individual chapters. Lots of the research is based on papers I did with a whole bunch of other archaeologists, historians. When it comes to understanding the collapse of the Late Bronze Age, I'm going to have, no matter how much I study, nowhere near a good idea as Eric Klein. So I did lots of work with Eric. Likewise, when it comes to Rome, Walter Schardell is always going to be far better than me, including being able to speak Latin. So I wrote increasingly upon Walter. The last one actually is a really good question. How do you balance the narrative with the evidence? That's something I very much struggled with. The first draft I gave to my editors, they were like, this is good. I love the ideas, but there's kind of no story here. You just got like definitions, causes behind collapse, impacts, etc. It's a good textbook, but it's not going to be very appealing to the average person. And for me, it was just about thinking through, okay, how do these things connect? And then what's the best way of building a story which is true to the material, but also doesn't actually like distort or undermine the material. And I was lucky enough that like the chronological approach, I think actually builds up the ideas and the evidence quite well. Right? So if you want to understand the impacts of collapse and why often disasters aren't that bad, then looking back to the Paleolithic can give you a good understanding of in general why we probably evolved to be better at managing crises and disasters. So basically start with the evidence first, and then afterwards find what's at least a threadbare narrative that can work with it. And I would say, even if it does mean, unfortunately, a less compelling story, a less cool story, try not to obviously skimp on the evidence.
So I think we've got time for one more question, but I think you're able to say another 15 minutes afterwards. Oh, okay, multiple people. We should have a
We can do
citizens
like rapid
jury.
fire, like 30 seconds if you like.
We can take both and maybe pass at the same
Yeah,
time. So Hugo, if you want to.
Two very short questions. One is, where any takes on AI and how this fits in the current history of
Mhm.
biggest political issue in what's important.
Yeah.
Is it important? Like, it's out there.
So who's this?
I'm just so excited that you're talking about like systems not consumer friendly because that's my background. And I feel like I'm not in EA whatsoever, but I think that there seems to be kind of a little bit disconnect in that privacy system. Maybe historically, is there any particular reason why it's been more crossover and the any things that might impede that sort of people that whether psychologically or culturally
Yeah. I'll say this way, actually. It's a very interesting question. This will be pure speculation. I think there's been several things. One is in effective altruism, both was its own movement, but it was also heavily influenced by the rationality community in the Bay Area. And rationality kind of has this almost kind of, I'll try to be nice about it, a sense of like epistemic superiority. Of there's better and worse ways of thinking. We do the good ways of thinking, ergo, it's probably better if we make the decisions. And that in many ways doesn't put you on a good basis for thinking about democracy in a favorable way. I think culturally, we've also just haven't looked as much into like governance and decision making as we should have. And to be frank, that's probably why certain problems in the EA have emerged, including with funders. There were people in the community who were saying we should probably have better checks and balances, including in our funders, and more transparency before SBF occurred. Self being one of them. But I think for some reason, culturally, there was just never as big an emphasis upon decision making and governance as there should have been. And that's probably just been reinforced over time as well. Probably not a fully conclusive answer. That's probably the best I have is both the impact of rationality and just a probably founder effect of focusing much more upon future tech rather than focusing upon governance and decision making. So let's start with immigration. It doesn't feature too strongly into the book. Interestingly, there are people who obviously say immigration is a cause of collapse, etc. That doesn't really seem to be the case in any cases I can look at. The sea peoples is the most common one of. There's basically these sea peoples who emerge and invade a whole bunch of places during the late Bronze Age collapse. Interestingly, that's fallen out of favor for numerous reasons. One being that most of the places which Ramses said the sea peoples attacked, we actually know fell to other empires rather than sea peoples. And additionally, there's just not much evidence of there being one big force. It seems to have been more a collection of climate migrants from basically southern Spain and Italy, as well as people who are probably fleeing from places like Iceland. But definitely not one big attacking force per se. The one thing I can say about migration based upon the book is that in the book I talk about the darker angels of our nature, so the dark triad of Machiavellism, narcissism, psychopathy. But one thing I talk about is what's called the authoritarian impulse, that we have pretty good evidence from social psychology when people feel threatened, they tend to become more embracing of authoritarian leaders and structures. And one of the best ways to make people feel scared, apart from having a cost of living crisis, is by saying it's because of the outsider. It's because of migrants. It's a pretty old, pretty effective authoritarian playbook, which we see being used to benefit. And AI, good one. In the book, I do address AI. I mentioned that we should probably think of this less as artificial intelligence, which is often struggled to have a good definition, and more as automated cognition. It's about essentially automating certain cognitive tasks, whether it be image recognition, spatial navigation, etc. And in the book, I put forward that I myself don't have particularly short timelines. However, the important thing is I don't know. And there's a very large proportion of people in machine learning and whatnot who are very concerned and do think there's a genuine threat that superintelligence could be built, which could kill everyone. And that leads me to probably just don't build them in that case. And in the book, I've put forward a whole bunch of reasons as to how we can avoid that, including obviously the obvious thing like having citizens, juries, and unions sitting over the big tech companies, but also things like making them pay for the data they use, having things like data unions, paying people across the supply chain, including compute, for instance. If you start to play miners in Democratic Republic of Congo properly, or even content moderators in Kenya, suddenly these things start to look a whole less profitable. And all you're really doing there is actually just, well, paying people properly and being honest. And apart from that, the only other like hot take I have in AI is, while I do think superintelligence is a prospect, although low probability one, what I'm really concerned about is the ability of AI to essentially supercharge and accelerate all the threats we face, whether it's misinformation, disinformation, killer robots, even things like the climate crisis. Fossil fuel companies are quite effectively using machine learning to try to find new fossil fuel supplies. But in short, very genuine problem whether you're thinking it's an accelerant or it's superintelligence. And I think the key thing is don't build it and essentially start to have some kind of economic accounting for the costs and paying people properly.
Fantastic. Can we give a round of applause?